"You don't belong up here," she said, loud enough for half the cabin to hear. He looked up, calm and composed, as if the insult hadn't just echoed through first class. What she didn't know was that the man she just humiliated without a second thought was a federal judge, and with one silent message, her entire world was about to change. He stepped onto the plane quietly, dressed in a navy blue suit, his posture upright but unassuming. In his right hand, a worn leather briefcase, in his left, a neatly folded boarding pass. His shoes were polished to a shine that spoke of discipline, not vanity. No jewelry. No flash. Just presence. The kind that filled space without taking any. Jerome Collins moved through the first-class cabin of the Horizon Air domestic flight like someone who had done this 1,000 times before, not with entitlement, but with earned ease. Seat 1A was waiting for him. As he approached it, he gave a small nod to the nearby flight attendant, a gesture of courtesy, not expectation, and sat down. He tucked his briefcase under the seat, adjusted his belt, and pulled from his coat pocket a slim book of poetry. He opened it slowly, like he had all the time in the world. He didn't check his phone. He didn't glance around. He simply began to read, immersed in quiet. Rachel Benton had worked for Horizon Air for 15 years. She prided herself on her precision. Her uniform was always immaculate, every button aligned, every hair pinned perfectly into place. Her walk was swift and balanced, her voice measured, her standards high. She called it professionalism. Others called it control. She moved through the first-class cabin like a commander through her domain, watching, noting, ensuring. Most days, this routine gave her comfort. Today, it made her pause. As she passed the front row, her eyes landed on Jerome. And something in her stopped. It wasn't what he was doing, he was reading, after all, but what he wasn't. He wasn't looking up. He wasn't engaging. He wasn't offering the subtle cues she was used to in this section of the plane. Something about him, in her mind, didn't match the seat. A flicker of doubt turned into an assumption, then a decision. She stopped. "Excuse me, sir," she said, loud enough for two nearby passengers to glance up. "Can I see your boarding pass again, please?" Jerome looked up from his book, brows slightly raised, but his face remained calm. "Certainly," he said, handing it to her. She stared at it longer than necessary. It read clearly, Seat 1A. First class. Jerome Collins. She blinked. "This is a first-class seat," she said, as if that fact needed confirming. "Yes," Jerome replied, his voice even. Rachel didn't hand it back. She looked again. At the name. At his face. Then back to the boarding pass. "Are you sure there's not a mistake? Maybe your company booked the wrong class?" Jerome gave a single, unhurried shake of his head. "No mistake." Her tone stiffened. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to move to economy. We can sort this out later, but for now, I need this seat cleared." Silence settled around them. One passenger across the aisle subtly lowered his tablet. A woman 3 seats back peeked over her glasses. Jerome didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He closed his book, placed the boarding pass back into his coat, picked up his briefcase, and stood. He walked the narrow aisle toward the back with a jaw tight, but steps controlled. Rachel stepped aside, arms lightly crossed, watching him go. He found a seat near the rear. No window. Less space. He sat, composed, and pulled out his phone. One message. Simple. Removed from first class. Boarding pass valid. No explanation. Waiting. He hit send and placed the phone face down in his lap. He didn't look angry. He looked resolved. In first class, Rachel resumed service. Polished smile back in place. Offering sparkling water to passengers she assumed belonged. She didn't know the message Jerome had sent had reached someone who didn't just care, they had authority. In the galley, Clara Green, a younger attendant, hesitated. "Hey, That man you moved earlier, she said cautiously. I saw his pass. It really did say 1A. Rachel didn't look up. The system must have glitched, she said. Or maybe he got an upgrade he wasn't supposed to. Clara hesitated again. He seemed sure. Rachel turned, sharper now. Clara, I've been doing this for 15 years. I can tell when someone doesn't belong up here. Trust me. But the certainty that had lived in Rachel's voice for years didn't echo as clearly this time. Something in Clara's face reflected that. Something uncertain. Back in the rear, Jerome's phone buzzed again. What airline? Flight number? Flight attendant name? He answered each one. In the cockpit, Captain Richard Ames glanced at the incoming call from ground operations with mild curiosity. That curiosity turned into concern within 30 seconds. Captain Ames, came the voice on the line. This is Malcolm Briggs, executive response. We have a situation involving a passenger you need to be aware of. Judge Jerome Collins. First class. Seat 1A. Removed without cause. Legal is involved. CEO is aware. Captain Ames froze. He looked at the manifest again. A sitting federal judge. First class ticket. Removed. We need you to speak with the lead flight attendant. Immediately. Rachel was summoned to the cockpit. Her heart skipped. Attendants don't get called midair unless it's serious. She straightened her uniform and walked briskly. Inside the cockpit, Captain Ames turned to her. Did you remove a passenger from seat 1A? Rachel blinked. Yes, but... Why? She hesitated. I didn't think he belonged there. You assumed. Rachel's throat dried. That man, the captain continued, is a federal judge. You removed him without verification. You had his boarding pass. You had the manifest. What do you want me to do? She asked in a whisper. You're going to fix it. Now. Rachel stepped out of the cockpit with a pounding heart. She walked quickly toward economy, each step heavier. Passengers whispered. Some stared. She crouched next to Jerome, her voice low. Sir, there's been a misunderstanding. I'd like to escort you back to your original seat. Jerome looked at her slowly. A misunderstanding? Yes, she said, too fast. An error. He raised an eyebrow. You had my boarding pass. You saw my name. What exactly did you misunderstand? Rachel fumbled. I didn't mean. You didn't question anyone else in first class. Just me. Why is that? Her mouth opened, then closed. The answer stuck in her throat. Jerome stood. Let's go. The walk back to first class wasn't silent. It was filled with unspoken judgment. Eyes followed them. Rachel didn't meet a single gaze. Jerome sat down again in 1A. Same posture. Same quiet dignity. He picked up his book and turned to the page he had marked. Rachel hovered beside him. If there's anything you need, she said. He didn't respond. Didn't even turn his head. She walked away slowly. Not powerful. Not poised. Just diminished. And in that moment, every person who had watched, every person who had stayed silent, understood something more than a seat had been taken, and something far more powerful was now being returned. Rachel stood frozen in the galley, the echo of Jerome's calm words still rippling through her ears. The seatbelt sign flickered overhead, casting a dull reflection against the stainless steel counter where her hands gripped the edge with too much force. Her once proud posture now wilted beneath the weight of silent stares, whispered glances, and the cold fact she could no longer ignore: she had made a mistake. A public one. And not just in front of the passengers, but in front of someone whose quiet presence carried more authority than she had ever guessed. Meanwhile, Jerome had returned to 1A without fanfare, without protest, and resumed reading like nothing had happened. But everyone knew something had. The air in the cabin had changed. Conversations grew shorter. Eye contact became rare. Even the clink of ice against glass in first class felt louder than it should have. Rachel moved robotically now, offering drinks to passengers who no longer met her eyes. Her smile faltered, her voice thinner. The illusion of control she'd always carried like armor now felt cracked. And below all of it, the question lingered, what now? Back in the cockpit, Captain Ames was reviewing the flight path when the in-flight phone lit up again. The voice on the other end was urgent. We've briefed legal. Judge Collins has already contacted his office. Executive oversight is monitoring this flight in real time. We need to de-escalate. Now. The captain nodded, jaw tight. He clicked the intercom. Lead flight attendant Rachel Benton, please report to the cockpit immediately. The call was calm, but the implication was not. Rachel nearly dropped the coffee pot. Clara looked over, uncertain. You okay? Rachel didn't answer. She wiped her palms against her skirt, fixed her blazer, and walked toward the front with legs that no longer felt steady. Inside the cockpit, Captain Ames didn't mince words. Did you move a passenger from 1A? She nodded. I did. Why? She hesitated. He didn't look like he belonged there. The words hung in the air, heavy. He had a valid boarding pass, the captain said. And you made a call based on your assumption. That man is a federal judge. You just committed a very public mistake, and the airline is watching. Rachel swallowed, hard. What do you want me to do? Fix it. The order was simple, but it landed like a thunderclap. She exited the cockpit with the same uniform, the same shoes, but none of the authority she had worn earlier. Her walk down the aisle felt like a sentencing. Whispered voices buzzed behind seatbacks. A toddler pointed and asked his mother why the lady looked sad. Rachel didn't flinch, but her throat tightened. She reached Jerome's seat, crouched slightly, and forced a professional smile. Sir, she began, voice brittle, there's been a misunderstanding. I'd like to escort you back to your original seat in first class. Jerome didn't look surprised. He looked still. A misunderstanding? Yes. It was an error, she said too quickly. It wasn't intentional. You had my boarding pass, he said, his voice low, even. You saw my seat number. What exactly did you misunderstand? The question pierced sharper than any raised voice. You didn't question anyone else up front. Just me. Why? Rachel opened her mouth but found no words inside. She nodded slightly, almost imperceptibly. I'm sorry, she mumbled. Jerome stood slowly, picked up his briefcase, and said simply, let's go. The walk back to first class felt like a march. Passengers leaned to look. Some whispered, others just stared. But no one was neutral. Rachel no longer looked like a woman in charge, she looked like someone trying to disappear. Jerome returned to seat 1A, set his bag beneath him again, and opened his book to the same marked page. He didn't glance at her. He didn't acknowledge her. She stood there for a second, unsure what to say. If there's anything you need, she offered softly. He didn't move. She turned and walked away, each step slower than the last. In the rear, Clara watched her return to the galley. What happened? She asked. Rachel poured a cup of water, hands trembling. I had to bring him back. Clara hesitated. You know who he is, right? I know now, Rachel said, voice flat. He didn't say anything. Didn't raise his voice, Clara murmured. That silence, that's what scared me. Rachel didn't answer. She just stared at the metal panel in front of her, feeling smaller than she'd ever felt in her life. Up front, Jerome sat composed, but his mind wasn't still. He wasn't thinking about revenge. He was thinking about how quickly dignity could be questioned without cause. His phone vibrated. CEO looped in. Formal review pending. Legal activated. He read the message, then locked the screen. A few seats away, a man in a gray blazer leaned over. "I saw what happened," he said quietly. "That was unfortunate." Jerome turned his head slightly. "Unfortunate?" The man fumbled. "A mistake. Or a misunderstanding." Jerome looked at him, said nothing, then returned his gaze forward. The silence stretched between them. At the front of the plane, Rachel stood behind the curtain. She had come out to check on passengers, but she was really trying to read the mood. It wasn't good. She pulled out her phone and opened the internal crew app. Nothing. No messages. No updates. Just silence. And that silence terrified her more than any confrontation. "Do you think they'll talk to you when we land?" Clara asked gently. Rachel didn't answer at first. "I told the captain I made a mistake." "Was it?" Clara asked. "Just a mistake?" Rachel didn't reply. Because she knew. Deep down, she knew. It hadn't been a one-time slip. It was something older. Something she hadn't even questioned until it stared back at her with calm eyes and a valid seat number. Jerome's phone buzzed again. "Be prepared for formal apology and crew review. Media notified." He didn't react. He just placed the phone face down and closed his eyes briefly. At the gate, 2 security officers stood ready. One wore a suit. One had a badge clipped to his belt. The door to the aircraft opened with a slow hiss. They stepped on board. The suited man nodded at Clara. "We'll escort Mr. Collins first, then speak with your lead." Clara looked shaken. "Understood." The officer walked to 1A. "Sir, we're ready when you are." Jerome stood, calm as ever. The passengers watched him go. A few nodded in quiet respect. One woman whispered, "He handled that with class." As he approached the exit, Rachel instinctively stepped forward. Her mouth opened slightly, as if to say something. But Jerome didn't look at her. Not even once. He stepped off the plane without a word. And in that silence, the judgment was final. The suited man turned to Clara. "Now we'd like to speak to Ms. Rachel Benton." Her name was no longer hidden. Not behind a title. Not behind a uniform. And with every step she took toward that exit, she felt the full weight of what she'd done, not just to a man, but to her own reflection. What waited beyond that gate wasn't just protocol. It was consequence. The door to the aircraft closed behind her with a hiss, but for Rachel Benton, it sounded more like a gavel. As she stepped into the fluorescent hallway flanked by internal affairs agents, the polished floors of the terminal didn't feel like the ground anymore, they felt like judgment. A blur of camera flashes erupted beyond the windows. Somewhere in the sea of reporters, the words discrimination, judge, and federal were already being stitched into headlines. Her name wasn't on a badge anymore, it was in press drafts and pending HR memos. She said nothing. She didn't even look back at the plane. What was there to look at? Her authority was gone. And she knew it. In a windowed office above the gate, Jerome Collins stood still, surrounded by airline executives with stiff collars and stiffer apologies. A senior VP extended his hand. Jerome looked at it, then eventually took it, not out of forgiveness, but because he knew it wasn't the real reckoning. That was coming. "We're conducting a full internal review," the VP assured him. "This incident does not reflect our values." Jerome gave a brief nod. His voice was calm, unshaken. "This isn't about me," he said simply. "It's about what made it possible." The VP nodded too quickly. Jerome could tell the man hadn't really understood. Not yet. Across town, the door to a sterile conference room closed with a soft click behind Rachel. She sat alone at a long table with her crew badge placed carefully in front of her like an artifact from another life. The logo on the wall read Horizon Air, but the silence was louder than any brand promise. Two investigators, one from HR, one from legal, sat across from her. A recorder light blinked on. "Miss Benton, this is a formal inquiry," began the man from legal, into the removal of Judge Jerome Collins from his assigned seat aboard Flight 714. "Do you acknowledge the incident occurred?" Rachel's voice cracked. "Yes." "Did you verify his boarding pass?" I saw it. But it didn't match my expectations." "What expectations?" "He didn't seem," she paused. "He didn't look like a first-class passenger." The legal officer leaned forward. "So you made your decision based on appearance?" Rachel didn't respond. She didn't have to. The silence answered for her. The HR rep, a woman with quiet eyes and a thick notepad, spoke next. "A formal discrimination complaint has been filed. This is no longer an internal matter alone." Rachel's throat tightened. "I didn't know who he was." "That's not the issue," the legal officer replied flatly. "The issue is that you assumed who he wasn't." Rachel closed her eyes. 10 years. 10 years of flawless records, mentorship letters, leadership awards. And now none of it mattered. None of it excused what she had done. "Will I be allowed to speak to him?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "That's not our call to make," came the response. "He hasn't requested contact." That evening, as twilight painted long streaks of gold across Jerome's study, he sat quietly by the window. He hadn't turned on the news. He didn't need to. The headlines were already predictable. What wasn't predictable was the message that had just landed in his inbox. The subject line was simple: accountability. The sender, Rachel Benton. He opened it. "I don't write this to seek forgiveness," it began. "I write this because silence can be a mirror. You saw mine and thought it meant submission. It meant restraint. I judged you the moment you boarded. I didn't ask questions. I didn't follow procedure. I just acted. I humiliated you. And you didn't humiliate me back. You simply let the truth reveal itself. That truth has changed me. I don't expect a response. But I needed to say it." Jerome read the email 3 times, slower with each pass. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't performative. It was honest. And that was more than most people ever gave. He didn't reply. Not yet. Across the city, Rachel sat alone in her apartment. Her uniform hung untouched on the back of a chair, its once crisp lines now limp. She didn't cry. She didn't post a statement. She just sat, the weight of her own actions pressing down in a silence far heavier than the aircraft cabin. Days passed. Horizon Air released a formal apology and announced new training initiatives on bias, perception, and power. Other airlines followed, not out of fear, but because the public was watching. College classrooms discussed the incident. Professors dissected it. Students debated it. Jerome declined interviews. But he spoke quietly at local universities and leadership summits. "Power," he said to a room of young people, "isn't how loud you speak. It's what you choose not to say. When someone tries to take your dignity, shouting doesn't make them listen, it gives them something to dismiss. But silence? Silence makes them reflect. And sometimes, that's louder than anything else." The room was still. One student raised her hand. "Why didn't you call her out?" "Right then?" Jerome smiled faintly. "Because the moment already had everything it needed. And I had nothing to prove." At a community center a few miles from the airport, Rachel began working quietly. Not as a flight attendant. As a counselor. Helping young people prepare for job interviews, navigate travel, understand perception. She spoke openly about what she had done. Not as a warning. As a reckoning. "I used to think fairness was a belief," she told one group of teens. "But it's not. It's an action. And what you do when no one's watching, that's who you really are." One student, a quiet boy in a hoodie, raised his hand. Why didn't he yell at you? Rachel paused. Her voice was softer than it had been in years. Because he already knew something I hadn't learned yet. What's that? The boy asked. That silence doesn't mean weakness, she said. Sometimes it means you've already won. Back in his chambers, Jerome stood behind his desk, robe draped over one arm. A clerk handed him a folder. He nodded. Thanked him. His court was about to resume. But as he glanced at the stack of letters from students, professors, pilots, even strangers, he realized this was more than one case of discrimination. It was a mirror, held up to an entire system. And this time, the world had finally looked into it. He walked into the courtroom, took his seat at the bench, and waited for the clerk to announce the case. No one questioned his place. No one challenged his right to be there. Because now, they understood, some people never had to prove they belonged. They just needed everyone else to catch up. As the author of this story, I want to leave you with a message that stretches beyond the walls of an airplane cabin or the silence of a federal judge. This wasn't just a story about one flight or one moment. It was about how quickly we can be shaped by our assumptions and how dangerously easy it is to act on them without questioning their origin. Rachel Benton didn't set out to discriminate, but she did. Not because she was cruel, but because she never challenged the quiet prejudices she carried. And that's where the real danger lives, not in loud hate, but in quiet habits left unchecked. Jerome Collins didn't raise his voice, didn't argue, didn't try to shame anyone. His silence wasn't weakness. It was wisdom. His restraint didn't come from fear, it came from power. The kind of power that speaks most loudly when it chooses not to shout. And in doing so, he held a mirror up to a system, and to every person in that cabin who watched and said nothing. We live in a world where speaking louder is often mistaken for being right. But sometimes, the most powerful form of truth is the one that doesn't need to yell. It just needs to stand still and wait. And when it does, it has the power to move systems, shake institutions, and force people to confront parts of themselves they've avoided for far too long. To every listener of this story, whether you felt dismissed, overlooked, or misjudged, or whether you've ever acted on a quiet bias you never meant to carry, know this: you are not powerless. You are not beyond growth. And your silence, your pause, your reflection can change the course of someone's life, including your own. Before I go, I want to say thank you. Thank you for giving your time to this story. Thank you for listening not just with your ears, but with your heart. If it stirred something in you, let that stir lead to something greater. Share this story. Talk about it. Learn from it. And most of all, carry it with you. On behalf of U.S. Heartwarming Story, I deeply appreciate every single one of you who continues to support these messages. Your presence here means that stories of justice, reflection, and humanity still matter. Don't forget to subscribe, turn on notifications, and join us next time as we continue sharing real stories that remind us who we are and who we still have the power to become.